The autumn leaves crunched under Thomas Wilson's feet as he walked up the steps of Pine Creek Elementary School. The mid-October air carried a slight chill, but Thomas hardly noticed it. His mind was on his daughter Zoe, a bright-eyed 9-year-old with a love for science and drawing. As a single father raising a black child in the mostly white neighborhood of Oakdale, Thomas made sure to stay extra involved in Zoe's school life. Thomas hadn't planned to visit the school that day. He'd taken the morning off work for a dental checkup that ended much earlier than expected. Why not surprise Zoe for lunch? He thought, checking his watch. It was 11:40 a.m., perfect timing for the third-grade lunch period. The school's front entrance was decorated with children's artwork celebrating fall. Paper pumpkins and colorful leaf cutouts lined the hallway as Thomas made his way to the front office. The smell of school, a mix of floor cleaner, cafeteria food, and art supplies, brought back memories of his own childhood. "Good morning," Thomas said to the secretary, a friendly older woman with glasses hanging from a beaded chain around her neck. "I'd like to surprise my daughter Zoe for lunch today. Is that okay?" "Of course." The secretary smiled, pushing the visitor sign-in book toward him. "We love when parents join us. Zoe Wilson, right? Such a wonderful girl." Thomas couldn't help but beam with pride. Zoe had always been a good student, curious and kind. He signed his name in the book and clipped on the visitor badge the secretary handed him. "The third graders should be heading to lunch right now," she explained, pointing down the hallway. "Just follow the noise. You can't miss it." She was right about the noise. As Thomas walked toward the cafeteria, the sound of children's voices grew louder. He smiled, remembering how Zoe often complained about how super loud lunch was. "It hurts my ears sometimes, Dad," she'd say. "Ms. Reynolds says we need our energy, but do we have to be so noisy getting it?" The cafeteria doors were propped open, and Thomas paused at the entrance, scanning the room for his daughter. The large space was filled with round tables, each surrounded by small chairs occupied by chattering children. Lunch monitors walked between tables, helping open milk cartons and reminding kids to eat their vegetables. Thomas spotted Ms. Reynolds, Zoe's teacher, a woman in her 30s with curly hair pulled back in a ponytail. She was helping a student with something at one of the front tables. Thomas was about to walk over and ask where Zoe was sitting when something odd caught his eye. The cafeteria didn't look quite right. Thomas frowned, noticing a pattern he hadn't expected. The students seemed to be grouped in a strange way. At the front of the cafeteria, children were eating what looked like hot meals, steaming trays with what appeared to be chicken, vegetables, and rice. But toward the back, at several tables pushed against the wall, sat a smaller group of children with what looked like paper bags or wrapped sandwiches. Thomas's eyes narrowed as he looked more carefully. The grouping wasn't random. The kids with hot lunches were mostly white students. The children at the back tables, the ones with the cold lunches, were mostly children of color. A knot formed in Thomas's stomach as he finally spotted Zoe at one of those back tables. She was unwrapping what looked like a plain sandwich, talking to the girl beside her. She looked so small sitting there, her colorful backpack hung on the back of her chair, her legs swinging because they didn't quite reach the floor. Thomas took a deep breath, trying to keep his expression neutral as he made his way across the cafeteria. Something wasn't right, and he needed to figure out exactly what was going on before jumping to conclusions. "Daddy," Zoe's voice rang out as she spotted him. Her face lit up with surprise and joy. "What are you doing here?" Thomas made his way through the crowded cafeteria, weaving between tables of chattering third graders. Some kids stared curiously as he passed, while others were too busy trading snacks or telling stories to notice him. The lunch monitors nodded politely as he walked by. "Daddy." Zoe jumped up from her seat when Thomas reached a table. She threw her small arms around his waist in a tight hug. "Why are you here? Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine, sweetheart," Thomas assured her, bending down to return her hug. "The dentist finished early, so I thought I'd surprise you for lunch." He glanced at the half-unwrapped sandwich on her table. It looked like plain white bread with a single slice of cheese inside. Next to it sat a small apple and a carton of milk. "Can I sit with you?" Thomas asked, pulling up a chair before Zoe had a chance to answer. He looked around at the other kids at the table, 5 other children, all of different ethnic backgrounds, but none of them white. Each had similar lunches, basic sandwiches, a piece of fruit, milk. This is my dad, Zoe proudly told her friends. A boy with glasses waved shyly, and a girl with braids similar to Zoe smiled. Nice to meet you all, Thomas said warmly, then turned back to his daughter. So, how's the sandwich today? Zoe shrugged. It's okay, just cheese again. Just cheese? Thomas frowned. What about the lunch menu? I thought today was supposed to be. He pulled out his phone and checked the school lunch calendar he'd photographed at the beginning of the year. Chicken and rice with vegetables. Zoe looked down at her sandwich and spoke quietly. That's for the other kids. The other kids. Thomas felt that knot in his stomach tighten. He looked toward the front of the cafeteria again, where the majority of students, mostly white, were indeed eating trays of what appeared to be chicken and rice with steamed vegetables. Ms. Reynolds says we get special lunches, explained the girl with braids sitting next to Zoe. Thomas kept his voice calm, though he felt his heart beginning to race. And who gets these special lunches? The children exchanged glances. The boy with glasses spoke up. The kids like us. Ms. Reynolds calls us her cultural diversity group. Thomas struggled to keep his expression neutral. And how long has this been happening? Since school started, Zoe said. At first I didn't mind because I like sandwiches, but now it's the same thing every day. And we always sit at these back tables. Thomas noticed something else now. The tables at the back were slightly shorter, making the chairs a bit too tall for the children. No wonder Zoe's legs were always swinging. Her feet couldn't touch the ground comfortably. A lunch monitor walked by, and Thomas smiled politely while his mind raced. He watched as the woman helped a white student at a front table, then walked right past their table without checking if anyone needed help. Does anybody check if you need help opening your milk or anything? Thomas asked casually. Zoe shook her head. We help each other. Ms. Reynolds says it builds, what's that word? Independence. Independence. Thomas corrected automatically, his teacher's instinct kicking in from years of volunteering as a reading tutor. As they talked, Thomas noticed other differences. The front tables had proper napkins, the back tables had thin paper towels. The front tables had metal utensils. He didn't see any utensils at the back tables, just finger foods. Most troubling of all, he realized the portions were different. The hot meals looked substantial, while the sandwiches were clearly smaller. Some kids at Zoe's table had already finished eating and still looked hungry. Thomas pulled out his phone and, while pretending to check messages, snapped a few discreet photos of the cafeteria layout. Then he took a picture of Zoe's lunch. Is it okay if I talk to Ms. Reynolds for a minute? Thomas asked Zoe, keeping his voice light. Zoe's eyes widened slightly. Are you mad, Daddy? Thomas smiled reassuringly and touched her cheek. Not at you, honey. Never at you. I just have some questions about lunch, that's all. As he stood up, Thomas spotted Ms. Reynolds at the front of the cafeteria. She was helping a blonde girl open her milk carton, laughing at something the child said. Thomas took a deep breath and started walking toward her, carefully planning what he would say. Thomas walked toward the front of the cafeteria, his shoes squeaking slightly on the polished floor. He could feel eyes on him, some of the children watching curiously, probably wondering why a grown-up was wandering around during lunchtime. He kept a pleasant expression on his face even though inside, his thoughts were racing. Ms. Reynolds was now standing near the lunch line, checking something on a clipboard. She looked up as Thomas approached, her face showing a flicker of surprise before settling into a polite smile. Mr. Wilson, what a nice surprise, she said, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Are you here to see Zoe? Yes, I had some free time and thought I'd join her for lunch, Thomas said, matching her friendly tone. I'm glad I did. I noticed something interesting about the lunch arrangements. Ms. Reynolds' smile tightened slightly. Oh? Yes, Thomas continued calmly. I couldn't help but notice that some students are getting hot lunches while others, including Zoe, have cold sandwiches. I checked the school lunch menu, and today should be chicken and rice for everyone. Ms. Reynolds glanced around, then lowered her voice. Mr. Wilson, I've actually implemented a specialized lunch program for our diverse students. I believe in culturally responsive teaching methods. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Culturally responsive? How exactly is a plain cheese sandwich culturally responsive to any culture? Well, Ms. Reynolds shifted her weight from one foot to the other. It's more about simplicity. Some cultures prefer simpler foods, and I've found that many of our diverse students don't care for the more complex menu items. Thomas felt heat rising in his neck, but kept his voice steady. Have you asked the students what they prefer? Or their parents? Because I certainly wasn't consulted about this change to Zoe's lunch plan. A few feet away, a lunch monitor was watching their conversation with interest. Thomas noticed her but continued. And I couldn't help but notice that all the students with these simpler lunches are sitting at the back tables, the shorter tables with uncomfortable chairs. Ms. Reynolds's cheeks flushed slightly. That's just for organizational purposes. It helps the lunch monitors. Helps them how? Thomas asked. Because from what I observed, the lunch monitors aren't helping those children at all. I watched for 10 minutes, and not one adult checked on Zoe's table. Ms. Reynolds's pleasant facade began to crack. Mr. Wilson, I understand you might be concerned, but I assure you I have the children's best interests at heart. This is a progressive approach to... Progressive? Thomas interrupted, his voice finally betraying his anger. There's nothing progressive about giving certain children less food based on their skin color. That's not progressive, Ms. Reynolds. That's discrimination. Several heads turned in their direction now. Ms. Reynolds's face had gone pale. That's a very serious accusation, she said quietly, and completely unfounded. I'm simply trying to accommodate different preferences. Then why wasn't I informed? Thomas pressed. And why is my daughter hungry after lunch every day? She comes home starving, Ms. Reynolds. That sandwich barely has anything in it. A tall man in a suit approached them, Principal Green. Thomas recognized him from parent-teacher night. Is everything all right here? He asked, looking between Thomas and Ms. Reynolds. Actually, no, Thomas said firmly. I was just discussing with Ms. Reynolds why certain students are receiving different lunches than others and why they're segregated to the back tables. Principal Green's expression remained neutral, but his eyes darted around the cafeteria, taking in the seating arrangement. Ms. Reynolds, is this true? It's being misunderstood, she said quickly. I've simply been trying an alternative lunch option for students who might prefer it. It's completely voluntary. Voluntary? Thomas couldn't hold back now. My 9-year-old daughter didn't volunteer for anything. She just does what her teacher tells her. Let's continue this conversation in my office, Principal Green suggested, gesturing toward the door. I'd like to check with some other students first, Thomas said. He turned and walked back to Zoe's table, aware of the adults following behind him. Zoe, he said gently, kneeling beside his daughter. Did Ms. Reynolds ever ask if you wanted this sandwich instead of hot lunch? Zoe looked nervously between her father and teacher. No, she just told us this is where we sit now, and these are our special lunches. Thomas looked up at the principal, and there you have it. The principal's office felt too small for the tension it now contained. Thomas sat in one of the hard plastic chairs facing Principal Green's desk, while Ms. Reynolds perched nervously on the other chair. The principal himself leaned against his desk, arms crossed, looking between them. Mr. Wilson, Principal Green began, I want to assure you that Pine Creek Elementary takes all parent concerns very seriously. Thomas nodded but stayed silent. He'd heard this kind of talk before, the standard opening line administrators used when they were about to dismiss a problem. Ms. Reynolds is one of our most innovative teachers, the principal continued. Her cultural awareness initiatives have been quite creative. Thomas leaned forward. Mr. Green, with all due respect, there's nothing creative about giving some kids smaller lunches based on their skin color. My daughter is hungry every day after school. I thought she was just growing, but now I see she's not getting enough to eat. Ms. Reynolds jumped in, her voice higher than before. The portions are perfectly adequate, and this isn't about race at all. It's about providing options that align with different cultural backgrounds. Then why wasn't I consulted? Thomas asked again. I'm Zoe's parent. I'm her culture. The principal cleared his throat. Perhaps there was a communication oversight. It wasn't an oversight, Thomas interrupted. I've spoken with several kids at Zoe's table. None of their parents were informed about this special lunch program. Principal Green's expression hardened slightly. "Mr. Wilson, I understand you're upset, but—" Thomas pulled out his phone and opened the photos he'd taken in the cafeteria. "Look at these pictures, Mr. Green. Every single child with a cold sandwich lunch is a child of color. Every single one sitting at those uncomfortable back tables is a child of color. If that's a coincidence, it's a pretty remarkable one." The principal took the phone and scrolled through the photos, his frown deepening. He handed the phone back without comment. "And it's not just the seating or the different food," Thomas continued. "The kids at the back don't get help from the lunch monitors. They don't have proper napkins or utensils." Ms. Reynolds stood up suddenly. "This is completely unfair. I was trying to create a supportive environment for our diverse students. Studies show that—" "What studies?" Thomas cut in. "What study says it's good to separate children by race and give some of them less food?" The room fell silent. A clock ticked loudly on the wall. Finally, Principal Green spoke. "Ms. Reynolds, how long has this lunch arrangement been in place?" She swallowed hard. "Since the beginning of the school year." "And who approved it?" Ms. Reynolds looked at her hands. I thought it fell under my classroom management discretion." Thomas felt a cold realization wash over him. "This isn't the first complaint, is it?" he asked, looking at the principal. Principal Green's hesitation told Thomas everything he needed to know. "How many other parents have brought this up?" Thomas pressed. "There have been inquiries," the principal admitted reluctantly. "Inquiries," Thomas repeated. "And what did you do about these inquiries?" Principal Green shifted uncomfortably. "We assured parents that all children were receiving nutritionally adequate meals." Thomas stood up now, unable to contain his frustration any longer. "But they're not. And it's not just about nutrition. You're teaching these kids that they deserve less, that they belong in the back, away from everyone else." He turned to Ms. Reynolds, whose face had gone from defensive to slightly fearful. "And you're using words like cultural awareness to cover up what this really is." "And what is that, Mr. Wilson?" the principal asked stiffly. "Discrimination," Thomas said firmly. "Plain and simple." Ms. Reynolds started to protest, but Thomas held up a hand. "I want to see the school district policies on lunch programs," he said. "And I want to see any documentation approving these special lunches, right now." Principal Green and Ms. Reynolds exchanged glances. "There isn't any documentation," the principal admitted. "This wasn't an official program." Thomas nodded slowly, taking this in. "So you've been experimenting on our children without approval or oversight." He pulled out his phone again and started typing. "What are you doing?" Ms. Reynolds asked, her voice shaking slightly. "I'm documenting everything you just told me," Thomas said. "And then I'm going to call someone who can help make this right." Thomas stepped out of the principal's office, pulling the door closed behind him. His hand trembled slightly as he leaned against the wall of the empty hallway. School artwork lined the corridor, handprint turkeys and construction paper pumpkins that would normally make him smile. Today, they were just a blur of colors as he tried to collect his thoughts. He looked down at his phone, scrolling through the photos he'd taken in the cafeteria. The evidence was clear: 2 distinct groups of children, 2 different lunch options, divided nearly perfectly along racial lines. He'd expected the principal to be shocked, to take immediate action. Instead, he'd gotten excuses and deflection. Thomas tapped on his phone's screen and pulled up the keypad. His first instinct was to call the school district office, but he knew how these things could get buried in paperwork and meetings. This needed immediate attention. These kids needed help today, not next week or next month after a committee had reviewed the situation. He dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional. Thomas took a deep breath. I need to report a situation at Pine Creek Elementary School. It's not a traditional emergency, but it involves discrimination against children and what I believe is a form of neglect. There was a brief pause. Can you explain what's happening, sir? Thomas laid out the situation as clearly as he could: the segregated lunch tables, the inadequate food for children of color, the school administration's admission that this unauthorized program had been running for months despite parent complaints. The children are being denied equal treatment and proper nutrition, Thomas explained. and the school leadership knew about it and did nothing. The dispatcher took all the information carefully. "I understand your concerns, sir. This does sound like a situation that warrants attention. I'm going to dispatch officers to the school and also notify Child Protective Services since this involves the welfare of minors." "Thank you," Thomas said, relief washing over him. "I'll wait at the school. My daughter is one of the affected students." After ending the call, Thomas wasn't done. He pulled up the contact information for the school district superintendent, which he'd saved when Zoe first enrolled. He'd never needed it before today. The call went to voicemail. Thomas left a detailed message, careful to stick to the facts. He ended by saying, "I've already contacted emergency services and I'll be reaching out to local news outlets if necessary. These children deserve better." Next, he called his sister Kendra, who worked as a lawyer specializing in education cases. "Tommy, everything okay?" Kendra answered, immediately concerned by the midday call. "No, it's not," Thomas replied, quickly explaining what he discovered at Zoe's school. Kendra's voice turned from concerned to professional in an instant. "Document everything. Take more pictures if you can. Get names of everyone involved. I'm canceling my afternoon appointments and heading over." "Thanks, Ken," Thomas said gratefully. "Nobody messes with my niece," Kendra replied simply. Thomas ended the call and slid his phone into his pocket. He checked his watch. Only 20 minutes had passed since he'd first noticed the different lunches. It felt like hours. He made his way back to the cafeteria. Lunch period was almost over, and students were beginning to clean up. Thomas spotted Zoe still sitting at her table. She looked up as he approached, her eyes questioning. "Is everything okay, Dad?" she asked as he sat down beside her. Thomas gave her a reassuring smile. "It will be, honey. Some people are coming to help make sure everyone gets treated fairly." Zoe seemed to understand the seriousness of the situation despite her young age. "Ms. Reynolds looked really mad when you went with the principal." "Sometimes adults do things they shouldn't," Thomas explained gently. "And when that happens, other adults need to step in and fix it." A commotion at the cafeteria entrance caught their attention. 2 police officers had arrived, along with a woman in a business suit carrying a briefcase, likely from Child Protective Services. Principal Green was hurrying ahead of them, looking flustered as he spotted Thomas and made a beeline for their table. Thomas stood up, putting a protective hand on Zoe's shoulder. "That was quick," he murmured to himself. The cavalry had arrived. Principal Green reached Thomas and Zoe first, his face flushed with a mix of anger and panic. "Mr. Wilson," he said in a harsh whisper, "calling the police was completely unnecessary. We could have handled this internally." Thomas stood his ground. "We're well past that point, Mr. Green. You admitted this has been going on for months despite other parents complaining." The 2 police officers approached, followed by the woman in the business suit. The taller officer, whose nameplate read Officer Chen, spoke first. "Good afternoon. I'm Officer Chen, this is Officer Rivera, and this is Ms. Patel from Child Protective Services. We received a call about possible discrimination and neglect involving students. Are you the caller, sir?" "Yes," Thomas said, extending his hand. "Thomas Wilson, this is my daughter Zoe." The cafeteria had gone eerily quiet. Even the youngest children seemed to sense something important was happening. The lunch monitors stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. Ms. Reynolds had appeared at the cafeteria entrance, her eyes widening at the sight of the officers. "Perhaps we should discuss this somewhere private," Principal Green suggested, gesturing toward the exit. "Actually," Ms. Patel from CPS said firmly, "I'd like to see the cafeteria set up exactly as it is right now, before anything changes." She had already pulled out a small notebook and was jotting down observations. Officer Rivera had moved to the center of the room, looking at the arrangement of tables. "So you're saying the students are separated by race during lunch?" "Not officially," Thomas explained. "But if you look at who's sitting where and what they're eating, the pattern is clear." The officer nodded slowly, taking in the scene. "And the different lunches." Thomas walked him over to the front tables, where a few trays still had remnants of the hot lunch. Then he led the officer to Zoe's table, where the remains of cheese sandwiches and apple cores told the story. Ms. Patel had begun quietly interviewing some of the children, kneeling down to their level and speaking in a gentle voice. Most were confused by all the attention but seemed eager to explain their lunchtime routine. A small boy with glasses, the same one who had explained the cultural diversity group to Thomas earlier, was pointing to the back tables and then to the front ones, apparently describing the arrangement to Ms. Patel. Meanwhile, Officer Chen was speaking with one of the lunch monitors, who looked increasingly uncomfortable as the conversation continued. "Let me see if I understand correctly," the officer's voice carried across the now quiet cafeteria. "You were instructed not to help the children at the back tables because they needed to develop independence." The lunch monitor nodded miserably. Principal Green attempted to take control of the situation. "Officers, I assure you there's been a misunderstanding." Ms. Reynolds was simply trying an innovative approach too. "Innovation doesn't justify discrimination, Mr. Green," Thomas interrupted, "and it doesn't explain why multiple parent complaints were ignored." Just then, the cafeteria doors opened again. A woman in a crisp pantsuit strode in purposefully. Thomas's sister Kendra had arrived, legal notepad already in hand. Close behind her was another woman Thomas didn't recognize, wearing a badge that identified her as Dr. Walker, District Superintendent. The superintendent's expression was grim as she surveyed the scene. "I received an urgent voicemail," she said, looking at Thomas. "Are you Mr. Wilson?" Thomas nodded. "Thank you for coming so quickly." Dr. Walker turned to Principal Green, whose face had gone from red to ashen. "I want to see your office. Now." As they left, Ms. Patel approached Thomas. "We're going to need to interview all the children affected, with parental permission, of course. But already from what I'm hearing—" She shook her head, disturbed. This should never have happened. Kendra had made her way to Zoe's table and was now giving her niece a quick hug before turning to Thomas. "I've started drafting a formal complaint," she said quietly. "But from what I can see, the school district is going to want to resolve this very quickly and very quietly." Officer Chen joined them. "We'll need formal statements from you and Zoe, and we'll be investigating whether this rises to the level of criminal negligence." The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch period, but nobody moved. The normal routine of the school day had been completely disrupted. Thomas looked down at Zoe, who was watching everything with wide eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Zoe thought for a moment, then nodded. "I'm glad you came for lunch today, Dad." Thomas felt a lump in his throat. "Me too, sweetheart, me too." 3 weeks had passed since that fateful lunch period. Thomas sat at his kitchen table, a stack of papers spread before him. Zoe was in the living room, humming to herself as she worked on a science project about plants. The sound made Thomas smile. Things were slowly getting back to normal. He picked up the official letter from the school district. The formal language couldn't hide the sweeping changes that had resulted from his discovery that day. Ms. Reynolds had been placed on immediate leave pending investigation, and last week the district had announced she would not be returning to Pine Creek Elementary, or any school in the district. Principal Green had received a formal reprimand and was now on probation, required to complete extensive training on discrimination and equity. Thomas's phone buzzed with a text message from Kendra. "Just got word. The school board approved all the changes we asked for. Every single one." He texted back a quick thank you, with several exclamation points, feeling a wave of relief. The path to these changes hadn't been easy. The days following his 911 call had been a whirlwind. News of what happened at Pine Creek spread quickly through the community. Some parents had been shocked and outraged, immediately rallying behind Thomas. Others, particularly those whose children had received the preferential treatment, had been defensive, suggesting Thomas was overreacting to just a lunch program. But the evidence had been impossible to ignore. The investigation by Child Protective Services had uncovered that this special lunch program went beyond just food. Children in the cultural diversity group had also received less assistance with classwork and fewer opportunities to participate in special classroom activities. Most disturbing of all, some of the children had begun to believe they deserved this treatment. When interviewed, one little girl had said, "Ms. Reynolds told us this is just how things are for people like us." Thomas shuffled through more papers until he found the list he and several other parents had created, a detailed plan for changes at the school. He ran his finger down the list, checking off items that had already been implemented. Immediate equal lunch options for all students. removal of segregated seating in all school spaces, new lunchroom monitors hired with proper training, monthly review of school practices by an independent equity consultant. Parent Oversight Committee established with diverse representation, mandatory training for all staff on bias and inclusion. The last item on the list made Thomas particularly proud. A new scholarship fund for college-bound students who demonstrated commitment to fighting discrimination. The fund had been named after Zoe's friend with the glasses, whose brave answers to investigators had helped expose the full extent of what was happening. The doorbell rang, interrupting Thomas's thoughts. He opened the door to find Lisa, one of the parents he'd been working with closely. "Ready for the meeting?" she asked with a smile. They had established a parent advocacy group that was expanding beyond just Pine Creek Elementary to address similar issues throughout the district. "Almost," Thomas replied, inviting her in. "Just going over some of the paperwork." "Did you see the news this morning? The state education department is using our case as an example in their new equity guidelines. They're calling it the Pine Creek Standard." Thomas hadn't seen it, but the news filled him with a sense of purpose. What had started as a simple lunch visit had sparked changes that would protect countless children. "Dad," Zoe called from the living room, "can Miss Keisha come over this weekend to help with my speech?" "Of course," Thomas called back. Miss Keisha was Zoe's new teacher, brought in to replace Ms. Reynolds. Unlike her predecessor, she had made a point of getting to know each family and incorporating their actual cultural backgrounds into lessons in meaningful ways. Lisa smiled. "She sounds happier." "She is," Thomas agreed. "All the kids are. They're not afraid to speak up now. They know they deserve to be treated fairly." As they gathered their materials for the meeting, Thomas thought about how much had changed because he decided to surprise his daughter for lunch that day. He'd taught Zoe an important lesson, not just that discrimination was wrong, but that one person could make a real difference when they saw injustice. "You know," Lisa said as they headed to the car, "my son asked me the other day if you were famous because everyone at school talks about Zoe's dad like you're some kind of superhero." Thomas laughed. "No superhero. Just a dad who couldn't stand seeing his daughter treated unfairly." "Sometimes," Lisa replied, "that's the same thing."